1. Greco-Persian Wars, the vote, the ore, and the open sky, 499 to 449 BCE. Stand on the beach at Marathon at dawn. The sea is a mirror, the plain is a drum. Across the water sits an empire, palaces, couriers, tribute roads lined like veins. On this sand, farmers in bronze, citizens who argued policy yesterday and lace sandals today. When the line moves, it's not kings colliding. It's a new idea testing its bones. Can a noisy, argumentative city decide its fate and keep it? The answer takes a decade to write. A Spartan king holds a mountain pass longer than men should. Athenian oarsmen turn wood and sweat into destiny at Salamis, where triremes knife through the straits and the Persian fleet breaks like crockery. The war is not just spears and ships. It's logistics, morale, and the shock of watching a superpower discover that numbers are not the same thing as leverage, when terrain, weather, and will point the other way. Why did this change the world? Because survival supercharged an experiment. Athens comes home from the sea and doubles down on citizenship. Stipends for jury service, pay for public work, a culture that treats argument as oxygen. The Delian League is born and soon behaves like an empire, but in the meantime, tragedy, comedy, philosophy, and geometry all sprint. You don't have to love their politics to see the hinge. When the Persians failed to fold the Greek city-states into the imperial ledger, space opened for a civilization obsessed with method, measurement, and public reason. Even the losers, Persian satraps, Ionian cities, feed the exchange. Ideas and artisans move both ways. There's a shadow, of course. Citizen excludes women, slaves, foreigners. Victory breeds arrogance. Allies become subjects. Athens and Sparta will eat each other later. But the long ripple is unmistakable. A proof of concept that a society run by speech and vote can mobilize like one run by decree and sometimes outthink it. On this beach, you can hear something older than any flag. The sound of a polity telling itself, "We decide," and then paying, bleeding, rowing, and building to make that line true. 2. Alexander's Wars, smashing borders, mixing worlds, 334 to 323 BCE. Open the map and drag a charcoal line from Macedon to the Indus. Now imagine that line as a column of dust. Phalanxes like living walls, cavalry flanking hard, siege towers nudging stone pride into rubble. Alexander is 20 when he starts, 32 when he dies, and in between he treats frontiers like suggestions. He inherits a professional army, welds Greek tactics to Macedonian muscle, and aims at the biggest target available, the Empire of Persia, because why not only wins if everyone agrees it should? Cities fall and rise with new names, many of them his. Garrisons become markets. The column carries linguists and surveyors alongside carpenters and surgeons. In its wake, the Hellenistic world appears, a network of polis where Greek becomes the handshake language of trade, law, and science, where Egyptian priests learn geometry from a Sicilian, where a Jewish translator renders scripture into Greek for a cosmopolitan diaspora, where a library at Alexandria tries, audaciously, to bottle the world's thought in one place. Why did this change the world? Because it replaced seams with threads. Koine Greek becomes a platform. Philosophy lectures in Asia Minor, medical texts standardized, astronomical models shared. When Stoics and Epicureans preach in porticos, they're selling portable ethics for cross-border lives. Centuries later, that same linguistic web will carry new ideas. Roman law, Christian letters, because Alexander's whirlwind left behind roads and habits of exchange. The price is hideous. Cities are sacked, soldiers marry into communities they don't understand, elites shift allegiance like weather vanes. The conquered learn Greek etiquette along with the tax schedule, and the empire itself is paper over thunder. The instant Alexander dies, his generals carve the map into kingdoms that will spend a century proving spears don't respect wills. But even as borders reharden, the mixture remains. Coins, calendars, sculpture, cults, hybrids everywhere. The old world did not vanish. It learned new tricks and new doubts. One man's ambition became a highway system for ideas that outlived him by millennia. 3. Qin Unification. Forging the state that wouldn't die, 230–21 BCE. Ride the road east from the Qin heartland and feel the ground under the horse. Packed earth, measured widths, mile markers set like teeth. For centuries, China's warring states bled each other pale. Alliances snapped, reforms tested, iron and crossbow made nobility less relevant than supply. Then Qin arrives with a cold blueprint and perfect timing. Merit over birth in the officer corps, farms measured and taxed, A census that turns people from shadows into entries, law written so that officials obey it as much as subjects fear it. The conquest is methodical. Rivers become invasion lanes. Fortresses starve. When the last rival kneels, the first emperor welds 7 quarrels into one machine and throws the switch. He standardizes script so a clerk from the south can read a docket in the north, standardizes axle width so carts run true on any road, standardizes weights and coins so taxes bite evenly, knocks down internal walls, and starts stitching together outer fortifications against steppe riders, the rough draft of what later poets will call a great wall. He centralizes ruthlessly, breaking noble fiefs into commanderies run by bureaucrats whose loyalty points to the capital, not to lineage. Why did this change the world? Because it created a template for a civilization that measures time in dynasties, not dynamos. The Qin state itself burns hot and briefly. Book burnings, collective punishments, conscript graves piled high. The bureaucracy outlives the man. Han inherits the skeleton, wraps it in Confucian robes, and perfects the rhythm. Exam-fed officials, granaries, canals, salt and iron monopolies, a tax state that can build, feed, and field at continental scale. Once you invent China as a governed whole, with roads, registers, and a shared script, you make it possible for poets in Changjiang to rhyme with merchants in Guangzhou, and for emperors to think in projects that take generations. There is darkness at the root. Legalist severity plants fear deep, diversity flattens under one orthography. The machine can feed or crush with equal efficiency depending on the hand at the lever. Yet the achievement is unavoidable. A political technology, central bureaucracy plus standardized culture that proves more durable than any more conqueror who rides in later. The map we still recognize began here, under a harsh law and a ruler who wanted a shape that would outlast his name. It did. For the Punic Wars, learning to breathe water, 264 to 146 BCE. Rome begins as a land animal, plows, legions, roads. Across the sea sits Carthage, Phoenician airs with harbors like jewels and a navy that moves as if the wind takes orders. The first clash is almost petty. Who gets to boss around Sicily? Then the Romans do something very Roman. They copy the enemy's superpower, badly at first. Ships that capsize if you look at them wrong, then brilliantly. They bolt a boarding bridge, the Corvus, onto their decks, turn sea fights into land fights, and drag marines across planks like polite pirates. The Mediterranean notices. Round 2 is Hannibal's opera. Elephants over the Alps, ambush at Trasimene, the perfect circle at Cannae, where a Roman army dissolves in its own dust. The city does not break. It contracts around its will. Fabius harasses, refuses big battles. Scipio learns in Spain, then carries the war to Africa. At Zama, the equation flips. Roman flexibility beats Carthaginian flair. Round 3 is a coda with teeth. Carthage besieged, streets leveled, a rival erased so completely that later storytellers add salt to the rubble, as if to season the moral. Why did this change the world? Because Rome swallowed the sea. Mare Nostrum, our sea, stops being a boast and becomes logistics. Grain from Africa, silver from Spain, ideas and gods hitching rides on freighters. Victory turns Rome into a management project. Provinces, tax farmers, governors, law that has to scale. It also slides a wedge into the Republic. Armies loyal to generals, wealth pooling in estates, slaves flooding the market. Fault lines that will crack a century later. The Punic story is not good beats evil. It's that institutions learn to adapt faster than charisma could conquer. Carthage could field genius. Rome could grow one. After these wars, the Mediterranean isn't a set of shores, it's a Roman lake with currents of culture running both directions. When you read later of emperors, aqueducts, Latin law, remember the clumsy ships that learned to fight like streets, and the stubborn city that refused to die when an elephant came to call. Dunge 5. The Early Islamic Conquests, a road network for ideas, 632 to 750. Picture the Arabian Peninsula after the Prophet's death. Tribes braided into a new allegiance, a faith young and fierce with clarity. To the north, 2 empires, Byzantine and Sasanian, are veterans of a ruinous rivalry, exhausted but armored. Into that space rides something unusual. Light cavalry that can think for itself, commanders who move fast without losing cohesion, and a message that offers order where tax and sword had offered only fatigue. Battles like Yarmouk and Al-Qadisiyah aren't just wins, they're doors. Syria, Iraq, Egypt open, then North Africa, Persia, the far hills beyond the Oxus. New garrison cities Kufa, Basra, Fustat, Kairouan sprout as administrative hubs. The conquerors do not try to erase everything, they layer on top. Arabic as an administrative language, coinage and post routes standardized, local law and communities tolerated under Dhimma with taxes that, in many places, bite less than the old regimes did. Under the Umayyads, a dome rises in Jerusalem. Under the Abbasids, a paper river flows into Baghdad, and a translation movement turns Greek, Persian, and Indian knowledge into a shared library. Why did this change the world? Because 3 continents got stitched. From the Atlantic to the Indus, scholars argue across the same grammar. Merchants trust scales and contracts across deserts. Doctors compare notes in a lingua franca. Algebra is refined, optics clarified, astrolabes perfected. Paper democratizes record keeping. The caravan and the Tao carry more than spice, they carry methods. Europe's future universities will drink from this well, Asia's trade arteries will pulse to this rhythm. None of this arrives without fracture. Civil wars, fitna split loyalties, minorities suffer when rulers do, the edge between tax and tolerance can cut. But the structural achievement holds, a network that outlives dynasties. When you picture a medieval world, don't draw islands of learning. Draw a map thick with lines where a jurist in Cordoba can cite a scholar in Nishapur, and a sailor in Aden can price a cargo for Guangzhou. The wars made borders, the after made a world. Number 6, the Mongol Conquests. Breaking the map, paving the road, 1206-1368. Begin in the steppe wind with a boy named Temujin, who learns that loyalty is a verb and tribes are software you can refactor. He grows into Chinggis Khan, and suddenly the rules of war change. Armies reorganized by tens, hundreds, thousands. Horse archers who can hit a coin at full gallop. Feigned retreats that turn triumph into trap. Siege engineers from China and Persia fold into the machine. Information moves on a relay system, the YAM, so fast it feels like rumor with saddlebags. Cities that resist are warnings carved in stone. Cities that submit become nodes. The empire stretches from Korea to Kiev, from the Caucasus to the Persian Gulf. Kublai builds a new capital in Dadu, Beijing, founding the yuan. Hulegu crushes Baghdad. Batu menaces Europe's edge. For a brutal century, Eurasia lives under one canopy. Pax Mongolica, peace by awe, trade by passport. A merchant can carry silk and stories from Venice to Cambay with fewer bribes and more way stations than the world had ever offered. Why did this change the world? Because walls turned into bridges. Gunpowder knowledge flows west. Papermaking refines. Compasses and cartography leap cultures. Medical recipes and plague bacteria travel the same roads. Yes, the Black Death rides these arteries and halves populations. But the arteries themselves don't vanish. They teach states the value of standardized weights, relay posts, protected caravans, and an elite tolerance rooted not in softness but in pragmatism. Tax farmers of any creed, artisans from any shore, envoys with safe conduct letters that terrify would-be bandits. The cost is stamped into the earth, cities leveled, fields salinized, libraries burned when the wrong gate is chosen. The empire itself fragments into khanates that learn different tongues, marry different gods, and eventually fall to the local gravity they once defied. Yet maps after the Mongols are different. Europeans know Asia is not myth. Chinese courts know the steppe can rule a dynasty. Muslims, Russians, like Persians absorb new habits of war and state. Stand where a way station once stood and listen. Hoofbeats are gone. The idea remains, if you can protect movement of goods, of people, of knowledge, you can make the world faster than fear. The Mongols taught that lesson with fire. Everyone else kept the road. 7. The 100 Years' War. Arrows, gunpowder, and the birth of us. 1337 to 1453. Picture a field slick with rain and pride. Knights in bright enamel line up to reenact an ideal that's already dying. Across the mud, English longbowmen dig in behind stakes, pull to the ear, and turn chivalry into arithmetic. Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt, names where thousands of feathered verdicts fell out of the sky. The armor gets thicker. The arrows still find the joints. But the headline isn't just tactics, it's state building under fire. To pay for endless campaigns, both crowns learn new tricks. Taxes become predictable, bureaucracies harden, credit systems and audits get teeth. Kings must justify extraction. Parliaments and estates win leverage. And in the smoke of siege and song, something subtler coalesces. Identity. French and English stop being just dynastic labels, and start sounding like people who belong to a story larger than a lord's banner. Late in the war, the technology shifts again. Gunpowder says hello, castles that mocked ladders kneel to cannon, the battlefield's social order cracks. A peasant with the right tool can decide a noble's fate. In That Churn walks Jean, a teenager with voices and audacity, who lifts a siege and a country's pulse before politics swallows her. Her arc isn't the war, it's the war's mirror. Charisma can spark, but institutions finish. Why did this change the world? Because Europe learned to fight like states. The war taught rulers to count, tax, borrow, and explain. It taught subjects to recognize a flag as theirs. By the time England limps home and France consolidates, the Middle Ages are quietly over. The era of professional armies, national myths, and governments that can afford both is underway. Chai. 1453, the cannon at the gate and the world tilting stand on the Theodosian walls at dawn. For 1,000 years, they've been a promise. Stone against the world. Then Mehmed II arrives with a city of tents, a chain thrown across the Golden Horn, and artillery so large it has a name. The bombardment is not a battle, it's a verdict. When Constantinople falls, Byzantium ends, and the map flickers. The Ottomans don't just take a prize, they make a capital. Istanbul blooms. Markets, baths, mosques, and a millet system that sorts subjects by faith for law and tax. Trade flows pivot. Overland routes now run through a power with its own ideas about tolls and treaties. In Europe, princes feel the pressure at their borders and in their ledgers. Scholars flee west with Greek manuscripts, lighting bonfires in Italian workshops where a brand new printing press is about to multiply them. The Renaissance doesn't start at the gate, but the fall turns up the oxygen. Why did this change the world? Because it rerouted ambition. With eastern choke points tightened, Iberian crowns fund sailors to go around, down the African coast, across a Gestad ocean. That detour will redraw everything from cuisine to cosmology. Inside the Islamic world, an empire with janissaries, bureaucrat soldiers made by policy, not birth, becomes a superpower that mediates between 3 continents for centuries. Orthodoxy shifts its gravitational center north toward Moscow, and medieval becomes a word school kids use for before the walls fell. If you listen closely, the cannons didn't just shatter stone, they cracked continuity, and out of the breaks came modern habits, gunpowder politics, print-fed scholarship, and a world that solves blocked doors by building ships. 9. The 30 Years' War. Hell, then a new operating system. 1618 to 1648, open on a window in Prague, and a very rude exit. Defenestration as political argument. What follows is misery with a calendar. Shifting coalitions of emperors, kings, and mercenary captains grinding Central Europe into mud and bone. Cities starve behind walls. Villages vanish between marches. Generals change flags more often than shirts. It begins as a confessional fight, whose creed, whose land, and mutates into a brawl for hegemony. Sweden arrives with drill and discipline. France backs Protestants for reasons that rhyme with Habsburg. Spain bleeds for lines on a map. Out of the wreckage comes a settlement with a strangely modern vibe, the Peace of Westphalia. Its core sentence is simple and enormous. States are the units. Princes pick religions, borders get recognized, envoys learn that you can hate a policy and still share a table. It's not utopia, minorities still suffer, wars hardly vanish, but the rulebook shifts from God says to sovereigns agree. Why did this change the world? Because Europe traded religious universalism for sovereign pluralism. Diplomacy professionalizes, permanent embassies become normal. The language of non-intervention and balance of power takes root. Meanwhile, war itself industrializes, standing armies, supply depots, drill manuals, and a tax state that can feed the machine. The human cost is obscene. Some German regions lose a third of their people, and the memory lingers as a warning. Ideology married to ambition can ruin a continent. When the ink dries at Münster and Osnabrück, nobody declares modernity. They just start acting like it, ruler to ruler, ledger to ledger, map to map. The window in Prague closes, the doors of protocol open, and for better or worse, the world learns to live with many truths inside many borders, arguing less with cathedrals and more with treaties. 10. The English Civil War and the Glorious Settlement, How a Crown Learned to Share, 1642 to 1689. A king wants money and soldiers. A parliament wants reasons and receipts. That's the friction spark. Charles I tries ruling without parliament. taxes by clever names, and knocks on church doors to make consciences kneel the same way. Pamphlets fly. London crackles. When the melting point arrives, it's pikes and muddy fields. Edge Hill, Marston Moor, Naseby, and a new kind of army with new kinds of officers, promoted for merit, drilled for discipline, paid mostly on time. The new model army doesn't just win, it starts asking why it's fighting, and then the unthinkable. A trial, a scaffold, a king's head, regicide written into the calendar. The republic that follows is a storm with a general at the helm. Cromwell crushes uprisings, stares down Europe, experiments with godly rule, and finally dies. The monarchy returns, older and jumpier. When James II tries to reassert royal muscle, standing armies, courts that bend, religion by decree, Parliament invites a replacement couple across the water. William and Mary land, James flees. The Glorious Revolution is bloodless, mostly in the telling. Why did this change the world? Because the settlement that follows sets rules for power. The Bill of Rights, 1689, says no taxes without Parliament, no suspending of laws, regular elections, free speech in the chamber. A financial revolution sprouts, credible debt, the habit of budgets, the bones of a modern central bank. Juries matter, habeas corpus matters. Ministers start answering to Parliament more than to a royal whisper. Print explodes, coffeehouses become rumor exchanges with ledgers. The crown still gleams, but it now reflects law. It isn't liberal heaven. Ireland pays in blood for English experiments. Dissenters and Catholics find doors shut. The franchise is small, but a constitutional reflex is born. When a British government overreaches, the instinct is not who has the swords, but what does the statute say? That reflex will be exported, copied, argued with, and improved upon, from Philadelphia halls to colonial assemblies that learn very carefully to say no. Ashnar. 11. The 7 Years' War, the first global shockwave, 1756 to 1763. Pick a point on the map and there's a skirmish nearby. Prussian infantry grinding in Saxony, British and French fleets stalking each other from the Caribbean to the Bay of Bengal, Mohawk scouts sliding through North American forests, company men in India bribing, bluffing, and battering their way into tax rights. It's one war with many accents, and it ends with ledgers on fire. In North America, the French-Indian War, forts trade hands in wood smoke and panic. Quebec falls from a cliffside gamble. Canada changes flags. In India, a young Clive turns a merchant company into a regime at Plassey, 1757, and Bengal's revenue becomes a faucet for empire. At sea, British captains chew up the lanes where bullion and sugar run. On the continent, Frederick the Great survives on audacity and luck, carving a Prussian future out of near ruin. Why did this change the world? Because victory handed Britain a globe and debt. Governing new lands meant garrisons, administrators, taxes. When Westminster tries to tap its American colonies, pay for your own defense, it discovers colonists fluent in the word rights. On the other side of the channel, France loses lucrative territories and gains a fiscal migraine that will, within a generation, become a revolution. In India, the company's win births a strange hybrid, private empire, whose extractive logic will reshape a subcontinent and then force London to grab the steering wheel. The war teaches hard lessons. Sea power is strategy, not scenery. Logistics decide continents, paper promises, credit feed cannon mouths. It also rebalances Europe. Prussia cements itself as a great power. Spain adjusts its posture. Russia steps farther into the Western dance. When the peace treaties dry, nobody truly rests. The fuse they've lit is short and hissing on both sides of the Atlantic. The American Revolution, turning subjects into citizens, 1775 to 1783. Start with a skirmish no one can take back, Lexington and Concord, then watch a rebellion borrow a playbook from philosophy. A farmer's militia becomes an army under a tall Virginian who hates grand speeches and loves good logistics. Washington loses and retreats, hits and runs, bleeds but never breaks. Pamphlets, common sense turned grievance into grammar. A Congress writes a letter to the world in July 1776 that begins with self-evident and keeps its nerve. The war is a pendulum. Saratoga surprises Europe and persuades France to lend fleets and money. Valley Forge turns suffering into steel. Yorktown traps a British army between redoubts and a French blockade, and a drumbeat slows. Britain is not conquered so much as exhausted, of cash, of patience, of reasons to keep catching fire for stubborn colonies. The treaty says borders. The real prize is permission to attempt something new. Why did this change the world? Because the aftermath writes a manual, a written constitution, not just customs, separation of powers and federalism, an amendment process that admits the framers weren't prophets. The Bill of Rights doesn't invent liberty, it nails planks over doors. Other peoples take notes, first in Paris with terror and brilliance, later in Latin America with generals and lawyers, eventually across the planet whenever citizens decide they'd rather be constituents than spectators. The contradictions shout. Slavery survives, expands, indigenous nations are shoved aside, women watch a rhetoric of equality stop at their threshold. Yet the template, imperfect, argued, amended, proves portable. Legitimacy from consent, power caged by law, leaders hired and fired without blood. An empire lost a piece of itself, an idea won a continent to test it on. The tests are still running. 16. World War I. The day old air ran out, 1914 to 1918. A prince dies on a Sarajevo street, and Europe pulls a thread it can't stop. Mobilization timetables click like mousetraps. Treaties do what human beings might not have done if given an hour to breathe. By autumn, the romance is gone. Trenches bite into chalk from the North Sea to Switzerland, zigzags of mud where boys age decades between whistles. Verdun grinds a nation. The Somme spends 60,000 lives before lunch. Poison gas teaches lungs new ways to fail. On the seas, U-boats make merchant soldiers. In the Dardanelles, Gallipoli proves courage loses to geography. Biplanes knit the sky with wire and fire. Tanks lurch into history like armored insects that learn to crawl. Empires discover they were fragile costumes. The Ottomans, Habsburgs, Romanovs crack. The Kaiser goes. The United States arrives late with grain, guns, and fresh legs. 1918 is a seesaw. German spring offensives burst, Allied counterpunches land, and at the 11th hour of the 11th day, the guns stop without really stopping inside anyone's head. Why did it change the world? Because it invented total war as a national habit. Ration cards, state planning, propaganda ministries, women running factories, science on the payroll. It planted flags that still wave. Self-determination in Central Europe, lines in the Middle East drawn with rulers and consequences. A League of Nations that failed but taught the grammar of global talk. It jump-started aviation, armor, radio, trauma psychology, and released a pandemic into a planet already on its knees. Modernity didn't dawn gently, it detonated. The 20th century looked in the mirror and saw barbed wire behind its eyes. And Haber 17, the Russian Revolution and Civil War. The Experiment Under Fire, 1917-1922. Winter bites Petrograd and the bread lines snap. Soldiers mutiny, workers strike, the Tsar abdicates, and suddenly a country without brakes is coasting downhill. The provisional government promises elections and keeps the war. The Soviets promise bread and keep a timetable. Lenin rides a sealed train back into the story with the April Theses. No half measures. In October, a small disciplined party takes big, undisciplined power, telegraphs, British ministries, captured in a night that rewrites calendars. Peace at Brest-Litovsk costs limbs to save the torso. Then the country catches fire. Reds versus whites, Poles and Czechs, foreign contingents on cold docks. Famine gnaws, the Cheka sharpens its teeth. War communism tries to command grain and loyalty from the center. Villages learn new words for fear. By 1921, the revolution shoots its own sailors at Kronstadt, then blinks and installs the NEP, a mixed economy bandage on a bleeding dream. When the smoke thins, the world's first socialist state stands battered and unbowed, with a party fused to the state and a security service fused to the party. Why did it change the world? Because it created a rival model that would shape the century's arguments. Planned economy, one-party rule, ideology as destiny. It inspired uprisings from Berlin to Shanghai, terrified cabinets from Paris to Washington, and taught regimes how to centralize police, propaganda, and production at industrial scale. It redrew borders across Eurasia, seeded the Comintern, and set up the bipolar script that the next war would solidify. The cost was measured in graves and silence. The impact was measured in how many capitals began planning not just their budgets, but their souls. 18. World War II. Total war, genocide, and the switch that rewired the planet, 1939 to 1945. Dawn over Poland and the word blitzkrieg learns to walk. Armored spearheads, radios, dive bombers, maps that change while you're still reading them. France falls fast. Britain stands alone under a ceiling of contrails and courage. The Atlantic becomes a math problem of convoys and wolf packs. In 1941, two doors blow open: Barbarossa to the east, Pearl Harbor to the west, and the war turns from continental to planetary. On the steppe, Stalingrad freezes an army in place and shatters it. In the Pacific, Midway flips the story in a weekend. Behind the front, a crime without bottom: the Holocaust, industrialized murder, rail schedules to hell, a moral crater that still smokes. Factories become cathedrals of effort. Women rivet wings, mathematicians tame radar, engineers teach bombs to think. The Allies storm Normandy, the Soviets break Berlin from the east. Tokyo burns in firestorms before two suns rise over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and humanity learns it can end itself by Tuesday. When the shouting stops, the map is new, and so is the wiring. Why did it change the world? Because it installed the century's operating system: the United Nations for talk, Bretton Woods for money, IMF, World Bank, a dollar-anchored order, NATO, and a mirrored Warsaw Pact for armed peace. Decolonization racing across continents as old empires discover the bill is due. It turbocharged science, computing, rocketry, medicine, and wrote the architecture of human rights in response to the abyss. It left the Cold War humming like a transformer, with nuclear deterrence as the uneasy logic that kept the next catastrophe theoretical. The war didn't just end a decade, it reset the planet, then handed us a question we're still answering. Now that we can destroy everything, what are we going to build instead? 19. The Chinese Civil War. One revolution, two futures. 1927 to 1949. Start with a republic that can't quite stand. Warlords carve provinces into personal logos. Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists promise order, rails, and a modern army. A smaller communist movement promises land and dignity to people who own neither. They fight, pause to fight Japan together, then fight again. In the middle comes an epic retreat, the Long March, that kills most who take it, but forges a myth and a cadre who think in maps and decades. Up in Yan'an, under oil lamps and cave roofs, the party writes a doctrine. The army serves the political line. Peasants are the engine. Discipline beats drama. When Japan falls, the ledger resets. The nationalists hold cities, ports, recognition, and hyperinflation that melts salaries by lunchtime. The communists hold countryside and loyalty paid in land reform and patient organizing. Guerrillas become field armies. 3 campaigns decide it: Liaoshen in the northeast, Huaihai in the heartland, Pingjin around Beijing. Rail hubs flip, hundreds of thousands surrender with their rifles, and a continent tilts. In 1949, Mao declares the People's Republic of China from Tiananmen. Chiang ferries a state, a flag, and archives to Taiwan, vowing return. Why did this change the world? Because a quarter of humanity picked a governing model that would anchor one pole of the century. The PRC built a party state, smashed landlord power, later wrecked and then rebuilt industry, and eventually fused markets with one-party rule in a way no textbook predicted. Taiwan, under the same long war's shadow, became an export democracy with world-beating chips. The split-shaped wars, Korea, Vietnam, alliances, supply chains, the map of tech, and the grammar of power from the UN Security Council to a factory floor in Shenzhen. One civil war produced 2 futures that still argue across a strait and through everyone's phones. 20. The Cold War. Missiles in silos, ideas in orbit, 1947 to 1991. Zoom out and the planet's a chessboard under fluorescent lights. 2 systems, Washington and Moscow, stockpile Armageddon and sell meanings of freedom. Berlin airlifted by propeller hum. NATO and the Warsaw Pact stare across tank country. A Cuban standoff teaches the world the taste of 90 seconds to midnight. Direct war stays caged by mutually assured destruction. The punches land elsewhere. Korea freezes at a parallel. Vietnam burns through jungle and youth. Afghanistan bleeds an empire. Angola, Central America, Egypt, Israel, maps turn into proxy scoreboards. Meanwhile, the rivalry gets weird and fruitful. A space race puts a flag on the moon and satellites over everything: weather, TV, GPS routes. Computing crawls out of defense labs. Microchips learn to count money. The internet takes baby steps. Arms control treaties, SALT, ABM, INF, teach enemies to write rules together so the world doesn't end by typo. The non-aligned try to breathe between giants. Decolonization explodes imperial maps into nation-states with fragile budgets and big hopes. At home, both systems harden. Surveillance, propaganda, dissidence, detente, then chill again. Why did it change the world? Because it rewired the architecture we still live in. The UN and Bretton Woods matured. Global trade lanes thickened. Human rights language sharpened in response to gulags and juntas. Science leapt forward on defense money and later consumer hunger. And because of how it ended, a reformer, Gorbachev, tries to loosen the screws. 1989 tears down walls with hammers and songs. 1991 dissolves a superpower without a shot fired at the core. For a moment, people said unipolar. The tech, treaties, and traumas of that era still run in the background of every headline. Nuclear umbrellas, space assets, fiber optic arteries, and the memory that ideology can organize both miracles and catastrophes. The missiles went quiet, the arguments didn't.